Good morning, it's 11:37 and you're with Britain's newsroom here on GB News with me, Tom Harwood, and Bev Turner.
So, a difficult subject now, but I think one that's worth discussing. A British man released by a Cypriot court after killing his seriously ill wife has said that he cannot find the words to describe how he feels.
Yes, 79-year-old David Hunter assisted his wife Janice, who was 74, with her suicide and then spent 19 months in jail awaiting trial.
So euthanasia is, of course, illegal in the UK, but some countries, such as Canada, have been relaxing their laws further and further recently.
So is euthanasia something that we should allow in certain circumstances, or is this a slippery moral slope?
So we're joined now by Catholic chaplain Father David Palmer and Anglican priest and author Reverend Michael Corran. Thank you both very much for joining us. It is a difficult topic and we are quite squeamish, aren't we, David, if I can come to you, around death. But it is something that we need to discuss. Do we have it right in this country or should we be making changes now?
Yeah, so I think, so the Catholic Church would teach that direct euthanasia, that's the intentional taking of life, is always morally inadmissible. And that's always been the basic position that society has had in the West on the whole. And I would say that's absolutely correct, because if you take away that basic assumption, what assumption do you replace it with? And I think that's the big issue.
Well, maybe
who decides whose lives?
Yeah, if I can bring you in, Reverend Michael Corran, maybe the assumption is that we should be more compassionate in an age where we have technology and science, perhaps, that would allow somebody to have what might be termed a good death.
Yeah, I would say more realistic, too. I mean, I wouldn't use the term euthanasia. I understand why you are, but I would call it assisted dying. I'm sure my colleague, and certainly myself, and we see death all the time. As clergy, a lot of my time is taking funerals, being with people on their deathbeds, being with people who live with partners who are dying. And in Canada, we got it appallingly wrong. We made it so permissive, it became, well, more than ludicrous, it became repugnant. And it's been put on hold, actually. But it should be extremely limited and tightly controlled. Someone who is going to die very soon and wants to be surrounded by their loved ones, not alone in the middle of the night, frightened, isolated. Someone who is in such incredible pain, the only way to deal with it is by making them constantly comatose, which does happen. Someone who is terrified of drowning in their own bodily fluid, which again is a fear that some people have. Now, these are very few cases. And in such situations, with a great deal of supervision, I think they should be allowed, but it has to be very tightly controlled. In Canada, at one point, we were saying yes to people who had mental health issues or quality of life issues. Well, that simply is not a criteria. But I've been married for 35 years, and my wife and I, and God forbid this would ever happen, but if my wife was in such agony she couldn't go on, I believe the compassionate and loving thing for me to do will be to help her find an easier way into what I think is eternity, not to stand by an ideology that meant that she was in further and constant pain.
Father David, what do you make of this point, that this is a more compassionate way forward, perhaps, that there's more dignity sometimes in this path than in the current situation where we see people in pain or so heavily medicated that they sort of lose any semblance of humanity?
Well, the word compassion is interesting in itself, because compassion means to suffer with. And the whole idea of compassion is that we stand with somebody in their suffering, not that we kill them, because that's quite the opposite. And I think sometimes it's more about the relatives not being able to cope with standing in that difficult situation than it is about the person. And I think it's also worth mentioning that palliative care has come on dramatically in leaps and bounds. And as Michael said, increasingly, the numbers who are actually suffering in the way we're talking about is getting less and less. And I would much rather see much more research going into palliative care than going down the line that we decide when someone's life is of value or not. But I don't know who gets to make that decision. And you could say, well, the person... Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I think you were going to answer what I was going to say. But what if the person believes it's their decision?
OK, yeah. So to give an example, in that situation, if someone's about to jump off a bridge because they have decided they want to end their lives, on the whole, we would respect those who go and try and persuade them not to, rather than the person who pushes them to help them.
And it's a very...
Should we throw that on back to Reverend Michael? Because I suppose this is a concern that people might not be fully compos mentis. How can we possibly know that this is a true desire, perhaps? What sort of... You describe safeguards. What sort of safeguards could possibly ever be effective?
That's an absolutely valid question. But can I first address what was said? Because with the greatest of respect, this is where I get frustrated. To use pedantry and to try and go back to an ancient definition of a word, to give a false comparison of someone jumping off a bridge. Suicide, and good Lord, I deal with suicides, that's a mental health issue. And it's not someone kill someone because you don't want to look after them. No, this is not what this is about. If you've sat with someone who is in agony, who is terrified of dying alone, someone you love dearly who is crying out, please just end it a little sooner than otherwise, that is compassion and kindness, and I believe also the Christian response. But your question is absolutely central. The guides have to be very, very tight and taut. The person has to request it. Once they lose the ability to, then no, I don't think we can proceed at all. It's not for other people to decide and define quality of life, but it is for the person whose life it is. Now, as a Christian, I believe in God. I believe God has absolute control. But in these years on earth, I think we are called to love others as ourselves. What would we want to do in such a situation? Would we want our life to be prolonged, usually by a very short period, simply because that was what was done in the past? Or would we want to maybe leave just a little earlier in dignity, with respect? I mean, I saw my grandparents die. My grandfather, who'd been through 4 years of the Second World War, won medals, been wounded and so on. He wanted to go earlier than he did. He was in a very bad state. Nothing could be done, but I don't look back at his final days and weeks and think that was a glorious time at all.
Father David Palmer, can I ask you about this specific case then of David Hunter, the 76-year-old who assisted his wife, who effectively held a pillow over his face, we heard in the court, so that she could die. She had blood cancer and she was in agony. Do you think he should have been released from prison?
I mean, I don't want to... I think the issue is not about being punitive to one person, because I'm sure what he did, he believed he was doing out of love and so on, and probably was doing it out of love. I'm not convinced that his choice was correct. But I think the issue is once we start kind of giving exceptions, then it does become a slippery slope. I mean, talk about the people with mental health issues. In Holland, not so long ago, a 29-year-old woman was assisted to die because she was depressed. And it's all very well saying, well, we can put stringent... Well, she wanted to die. So if we just say it's entirely down to the autonomy of the person, the society decided that actually that was wrong, that shouldn't have happened. But, you know, we can't just be down to individual autonomy because we are members of society. We affect each other.
These are false arguments, because we want a system where the person has to request and then a number of doctors have to say this is acceptable. We've got to be realistic and deal with people's pain and issues, not to live by an ideology that isn't applicable, I think, to the human condition.
Well, to both of you, thank you so much for this discussion. So many serious and valid points on either side of this. Catholic chaplain Father David Palmer and Anglican priest and author Reverend Michael Corrin, thank you so much for joining us.
And we just want to say, if you were affected by anything you heard in that discussion, there are organisations that can offer you help. The Samaritans, of course, are there. 300